Okay, rulers, settle down. Ruler School is brought to you by Odyssey Games, where you can go to get pre-orders of all the upcoming Force of Will sets, as well as releases of previous sets after they come out. TCGPrime.com with over 100,000 Force of Will singles, as well as out-of-print boxes from the past, and TCG accessories, as well as FoulLibrary.com, a wonderful resource for deck lists, article discussions, and more. Check them out at FoulLibrary.com, as well as these amazing patrons. Special thanks to guest lecturer member Vite Ramen. Thank you for your support. Class is in session.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Top 20 series here on the Ruler School Yearbook. My name is Paul, and today I'll be giving you the top 20 fire cards for the Wanderer format. These cards come from Grimm Cluster all the way up through the Saga Cluster. These cards have been tested over the course of time, and not only New Frontiers, but also in the Wanderer format since it's been a thing. So today, you're going to be looking at 20 or more fire cards that Jeremy and I thought were probably the best in the format as it is right now, if you don't include the cards we get from Dual Cluster. All that being said, if you hear the names of these cards and you're like, I kind of want to buy those, probably off of TCGPrime.com, because that's where you can get all your Force of Will singles. That list is going to be down in the description below. Of course, we're not going to spoil the top 20 list by giving you all of those cards in order. So you're going to have to still watch the video to see what we think are the top 20 fire cards in Force of Will's Wanderer format. And today we're going to start this list off with number 20, Sylvia Lilias. So this card, when you first look at it, it doesn't look too impressive. It's one of those cards where the longer you look at it, it sort of says, well, it can attack twice, it can add strength counters, it can do some other things. But really, in combination with other particular rulers, this card can be a win condition all on its own. I would argue that in Keurig decks, this pretty much takes over Paelieli's space as a win condition. Mostly because that card has slowed down over time, and this card is just really, really good for strength counter support, and pairs really well with all of the strength counter support that we got in EDL. So we thought this card very much encapsulates this list. It's a strong, fast, powerful fire card that can kind of just win the game out of nowhere if you don't respect it. And that's kind of what fire is all about. But there's also another element that fire is known for, and that is burn damage. That's why we have number 19 on here, Spiral of Chaos. And if you remember from our top 20 light cards video, you remember that Master Runes, if they have Chant in addition to their Master Rune status, can be included in the main deck as well as in the Rune deck for your Rune Rulers. That's super complicated as far as a mechanic goes for this particular video, but it's got a low divinity cost, so that's really good for runes. It has the ability to deal just a massive amount of damage. It's one of the very rare cards that actually deals damage, and then the remainder of that card's capacity goes to your opponent. So this card is really, really powerful, and is honestly one of Isis's best cards if you were going to ever run that ruler in the Wanderer format. This card is amazing. It's a really good piece of removal and burn damage. It just really lowers the threshold of your win percentage damage, so that's really, really great. And fire is really known for its burn. It's really known for fast, speedy, high attack sort of things. Pierce is also really huge for the fire element. But that being said, one of the best burn cards we've gotten in recent sets is number 18 on this list, Gradius. This card in New Frontiers is probably one of the best fire cards, period. All that being said, it removes the abilities of your opponent's J Resonator and then deals 800 to that card. All of this being said, this is super, super good against Order Rulers, which are the new rulers that are just coming out. It's really strong against rulers that have Eternal. So this is a really good way of just making sure that your opponent is just burned out completely. It's probably one of the main reasons Celesta as a ruler is going to have a really hard time in the current format. If your opponent's aware of the format and they're playing Gradius, it's going to be really strong for that particular reason. It's strong in Violet because you get the effect if it's discarded from her effect. Gradius overall is just one of the best damage removing cards that we have for your opponent's Resonators. It also blanks their effects, which is just kind of nuts. all things being said, there are very few cards that just simply remove the effect and then act as a piece of removal as well. That being said, we're going to go back to one of the basic swiftness resonators that we have in the game, and that is going to be number 17 on this list, Majin Dark Elf. This card works really well with the Nullstone, in that you ping yourself for 200 damage so you can generate red will, and then you play this, which is really the only way you can play it, but it gives you a natural affinity for both black and red. So this card fits really well into those kinds of decks. We saw a lot of these being used in Keurig strategies because, you know, there's quick 600 damage on turn 1 if you get that Nullstone, which is really strong. But overall, this card is just the quintessential swiftness resonator. It's got big stats, it comes out turn 1 and it starts swinging, and it's a threat very early on, and that kind of encapsulates what fire is overall. Last but not least, we have probably one of the strangest cards on this list because it is something we haven't seen in a very, very, very long time. Cthugga, the Living Flame. This card is, you know, admittedly a little strange looking. It's a 3-drop with swiftness and it's a 5/5, so it doesn't look very impressive, but the fact that you can play it essentially for free with its incarnation effect is incredible. This is one of those cards that as the game gets older, it's probably just going to be in your mind more often than not. This card, when paired with another card on this list, is very, very strong. The fact that you can just summon it, swing for 5, tribute it off to play another one from your hand and just keep swinging until you run out. It's just really fast early damage, especially since in Force of Will, the battle step doesn't delay if you go first, so you're able to just play your stuff with swiftness and attack into your opponent with not any issue on turn 1. And this card was included in a lot of decks like Baja Blast way back in Grimm Cluster, and it's been reprinted as a Wanderer promo, so this card has a lot of nostalgia attached to it, and it's probably one of the stronger aggressive cards that we've had in the game's history. So now that we've gotten done with the bottom 5 of this list, I'm just going to say hit that bell if you like content like this, and hit subscribe for more content like this. We also have basically a nice foundation for what red is trying to do as a color in its identity. For the most part, this is going to be the case from here going on. However, there are going to be some cards that kind of go outside that a little bit to sort of blend in with other archetypes. Number 15 on this list is going to be one of the funnest cards that we got in the new Valhalla cluster, and that is Ushuah, the Swordsman of Eternal Flame. This card, when it enters, it looks at the top cards of your deck and gets a resonator from the top and just throws it into the field. This card is amazing. It has so many just powerful effects. This card was very much paired up with a heroic epic of the Thousandth Night, kind of like Izanagi last time. So this is one of your prime targets for that powerful card, which will be in a future list once we talk about it a little bit. And this card was really, really solid in Isis lists before we got Nyarlathotep, the Isis Resonator, and some of the color fixing things that we got in DBV. This card was solid. There's a lot of ways you can apply it today, and we just thought it deserved to be a little bit higher up on this list. Next up, we have Welser, the Archmage of Fire. Now, again, this card has big stats, and it has a big cost associated with it, but it also has one of the very few God's Arts on a Resonator. Not something you see very often in Force of Will. God's Arts usually reserved for rulers and J-rulers. However, the God's Art on this particular card is very interesting, and it's very different than most cards. I would anticipate this to be in something like blue or even in green. But basically, you play your God's Arts, and while this card is on the field, you can copy the effect of a spell that you put on the chase, and then you get to select new targets. There are very few cards that actually copy abilities in the game, so this card is very fascinating in that it gave Red some interaction, some additional burn effects, high utility, very powerful Resonator overall. It usually is a one-shot sort of thing, so it's a little bit lower on this list, but even so, this card has a lot of applicability, even in the current format, and probably will as the game gets older and we get more spells, more chance to actually do things that are a little degenerate, maybe. You'll be able to copy them with Welser if they're in red, which is super fun. So we thought this card definitely deserved to be on this list. Next up, we have this card. Once I find it on my list down below, because I can't see. Aha. The Witch of Quenched Fire. I'm going to take a sip of coffee, and then I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. So admittedly, this card has sort of fallen off in terms of its New Frontiers potential. But the fact that it exists at all is kind of the reason it's on this list to begin with. This is the anti-burn red card, which is a little bizarre, but here she is. She's accessible with Witch of the Fallen Kingdom, which you'll see in a few more videos. And she's one of the higher utility witches that we got in Assault on the Demonic World set. So basically it just says if damage would be dealt to you by a fire source that is dealing you damage directly or is trying to apply damage to the board, it just stops. It doesn't stop the attack, but like any damage from an attack, but it does stop things from like an effect. Any effect damage is just completely stopped by this card. And the fact that it's accessible because of Black Witch, or just, you know, as a one or two of in your main board, and then additional ones in the sideboard for, you know, the red matchup is just an interesting tool to have. It's one of the more interesting cards that red has because it stops its own color from going off, which I think is kind of funny. That being said, it's a little bit lower on this list because there is not a lot of this being played right now, but it exists, and for that particular reason, we're just going to keep it in mind putting it on this list. Next up, though, we have the Shrine of the Dragonoids. Now, this card, you would think that it's not going to do all that much when it first hits the field. It only adds 200 damage when you tap it. However, you have to be reminded in Force of Will that if you leave this up during your recovery phase and tap it during that phase, it does recover with your stones and your resonators, and you're able to tap it down again. So pretty quickly, all of your spells are going to be able to do 200 or even 400 more damage than they would normally. Suddenly your thunders become 900 damage as opposed to 500 damage, giving the latter parts of my list away a little bit. But Shrine of the Dragonoids is incredibly powerful. Anytime a fire source would deal damage, you deal 200 plus the number of times the number of times you've actually tapped this down, which makes this card pretty nutty. When Epic of the Dragonlord first came out, this is one of those cards that people were like, does this thing need to be banned? Because this thing is really, really, really good with how Lilias utilized it. And as, you know, more burn cards come into the game, especially in the Wanderer format, this might be one of those cards that, you know, it doesn't cost too much, so you won't lose as much tempo if you do play it, but it just helps you provide a little bit more reach, especially in combination with something like Welser. You're going to be dealing a lot of damage. So we thought Shrine of the Dragonoid should be higher up on this list. Next up is one of my favorite red cards, and that is Ultra Dragon Shooting Star. Or as I called it when it first came out, Shooting Star Dragon, which is a very different card. But Ultra Dragon is really interesting in that if your opponent attempts to cheat in a Resonator, that is, they have a card like Heroic Epic of the Thousandth Night, something that is not putting that card onto the chase and then paying its cost, it's instead cheating that card into the field from the graveyard, from the hand, from play, from the deck, you know, anywhere else essentially without paying its cost. This card will zap it for 2,000 damage. If that sounds a lot like Slifer the Sky Dragon from Yu-Gi-Oh! To you, that's another reason I really love this card. It just zaps them for 2,000 points of damage, which is hilarious. And it's only your opponent, so even if you have this in your particular deck, and you're cheating your own stuff in, or things are entering the field without being played, Ultra Dragon Shooting Star is going to be shooting your opponent's Resonators only, unlike something like Exorcist Mage, which would see anything come into the field without being cast and just automatically remove it. Now, you might remember on the channel that I had a Lumia deck that I built a pretty long time ago at this point, a couple of months now, and I used Shooting Star Dragon in that deck. Just did it again, I know I did. You play Ultra Dragon in that deck, and that was a way of sort of getting around the fact that Lumia flickers and brings things into the field without casting them, and so it was a good way of having a big body that had barrier blue and black on it, so your opponent can't do things like, oh, I don't know, Thunder Parasol or any removal in black can't target it, which is really good. And it just has natural flying. It's a 10/10. It's a 3-drop. It's really something that's solid to just play. And any really good base red deck, Ultra Dragon is just amazing. So he deserves to round out the bottom half of this list. Now, you wouldn't expect this next card to be in red, but like I said, red is a little squirrely in the way that it's able to sort of sneak in certain cards that you wouldn't think work in it. And that card in particular, it's going to be Burial Rites, but this is the first time on this list that we're going to have this twofer. Fetal Movement in Outer World. Now, Burial Rites and Fetal Movement are going to be relatively cheap and easy for you to find, but they're always going to be really strong sideboard cards, if not main board cards. You know, if there's a lot of graveyard manipulation in the format, Burial Rites is very strong for that particular reason. I remember, especially around the time that Rezard came out, the Alice Origins Rezard came out, Burial Rites was very, very popular because it was able to remove the graveyard and deal a little bit of damage as a result of that. Fetal Movement from Outer World is pretty much the exact same thing. There's a little bit of an errata on it, so just take that with a grain of salt. But the fact that we have cards in red that remove the graveyard is really strong for base red. Otherwise, you'd have to splash into black and play Evil Elemental Uprising and some other things. So having these cards is actually really helpful. They're fairly cheap. Burial Rites a little bit over Fatal Movement just because of how cheap that card is, but Girion as a card also exists. So they're both on here because they both essentially do the same thing. And they have high utility in the formats going forward. So that's why they are at number... Well, they're supposed to be... I think I screwed up. I jumped ahead a little bit. These are actually number 9. Number 10 on this list is Play Dead. Okay, so this is number 10. Burial Rites, Fetal Movement was number 9. Just got a little ahead of ourselves. Play Dead is really strong because it allows you to pretty much re-trigger enter effects. There are a lot of cards in the game that if they die and come back have really strong enter effects, and it's quick cast. It works really well with something like Lilias, the J-Ruler, or as Keurig with the J-Ruler, and it's really strong in that way. So basically, you remove a certain number of strength counters, and you target a resonator that's going to go to the graveyard, and it just comes back. And that way, it's kind of like Power of Immortality, except now red has access to it. So think about this in terms of something like, Ushua, who was earlier on this list. So Ushua having an enter effect would be really, really strong to have it trigger again. So if your opponent is able to kill it, you're able to play Dead for 1 and bring it back relatively easily. So this card is, it was on the ban list for actually a very long time until it was recently removed, which is really good. No longer having to Play Dead, it's back, so that's great. Play Dead is number 10 on this list. And because we already done the number 9, a little backwards, sorry about that again, we have Perceval, Fascinated by the Holy Grail. This is your rush deck in red staple. Essentially, look at the top 5. You can either get a Regalia or a Fire Resonator with total cost 2 or less and add it to your hand, and you put the rest on the bottom of the deck. And then you can banish this card to deal 200 damage to target J Resonator or your opponent. Automatically, this is saying scry the top 5 cards, look for cards you need in order to keep going. Look for your Sylvia Lilias. Look for your Witch of Quenched Fire. Look for your Majin Dark Elf. Look for, a little bit later on, your Sprinting Flame Horse, your Guinevere, anything else that you can put on the field. And of course, this counts for multi-attribute cards as well. So if you have something that's like red and black or red and green, that this card can actually search it out, which is really helpful. This card just has a lot of high utility, especially if you're going for a very aggressive red deck, or if you're playing something that has regalia associated with it. This card is really strong for that particular reason, and the added damage is just gravy on the cake, which is gravy on the side. So don't put gravy on your cake. It's really, really bad. But Perceval is one of the best cards Red has received in a while, and so it's number 8 on this list. Next up we have Rook Egg. Now Rook Egg is really interesting because it's a search effect off of a resonator in red, and it's one of the primary cards that when it came out in Alice Cluster, the original Alice Cluster, this thing just sort of it was kind of insane. Alongside Cathuga and Guinevere, which is coming up a little bit, actually is coming next on this list, Ruhk Egg was able to give you tons of hand advantage by also searching out any fire resonator from your deck, regardless of cost, regardless of what it just has to be fire attribute in part or in whole, and you basically just have to let it die on the field. With things like Leviathan the Demon Sword, which is banned, so you can't even use it anymore, or Guinevere, Cthugga's ways of getting rid of it on the field, it helped to propel Baja Blast to one of the top red decks of all time, frankly. When it was released again in Alice Origins, there were a couple of elements that were missing to make this card really pop off again, but the fact of the matter is, the more fire resonators come into the game, the more tempting this card is going to be, especially if those resonators are powerful. Its partner in crime, of course, is number 6 on this list, Guinevere, the Jealous Queen. This is going to essentially read tap, sack something your opponent is going to kill with a spell or by battle, draw 2 and discard 1. This card alongside Rook Egg created a really powerful mid-range draw engine that, increased consistency for any deck running red. It was one of the main hallmarks of the Necrolance deck that came out alongside, a ton of things. Lancelot being one of those. Lancelot not being on this list, as you might notice, it kind of fizzled out as time went on. But between this card, Rook Egg, and Lancelot, and Necromancy the Undead Lord, you had a really strong mid-range competitive deck in the latter half of Alice Origins. And Guinevere, even today, I will splash Guinevere in so many different decks just because it's a little added draw power. It helps to make your opponent's cards feel worse by turning their card into more of your cards. It's just a really good card. I think as the game has gone on, this card has become more tame. But it was absolutely crazy when it first came out, let me tell you what. Next up, we have another tie, and this time it's going to be for 5th place. So we have a combination here of Thunderwolf / Thunder, and then Lightning Strike. And I'll tell you why these are number 5 on the list. This is one of the bread and butter cards of red. So Thunderwolf is the reprint of Thunder that we got in Epic of the Dragon Lord, which means in New Frontiers it is still legal, but it's a 4 cost total in your deck and in your hand. But it can function as Thunder. It can deal 500 damage to your opponent, or it says technically target player, which is a big distinction, or target resonator, J resonator your opponent controls. Where it differs from Lightning Strike is Lightning Strike actually gets around and it does not target. So there might be decks where, you want to be dealing damage that does not target your opponent in case they do things like, play Winds of Asgard, Wings of Gold to give themselves a barrier. This is a really good way of getting around that and preventing them from not taking any damage. So these really do kind of mix together. The fact that Thunderwolf is attached to Thunder in this situation, I think makes it just a little bit better than the regular Thunder, which has been reprinted. I think it was printed once in Grimm Cluster and once again in Alice Origins Set 1. But the fact that Thunderwolf is attached to this and it has precision and swiftness and it can actually deal damage, it gives just a little bit more utility to Thunder overall. Overall, these things, though, these 2 cards are really tied for 5th place because they do the same thing but slightly different. And they do those different things in different places in the meta. Again, if you're not trying to get, if you're trying to get in that last 500 and you're trying to get around barrier to target the target player, a Lightning Strike is really good. Or if you just want more bodies, more mid-range stuff, Thunderwolf/Thunder is really good for that. Next up, we have, again, some of these dual cards are going to have their original print available next to it. Just so you all are kind of aware that there are 2 printings of this. So there are technically 8 total copies of Split Heaven and Earth that you can play in the Wanderer format, which is why Ground Splitter Rabbit and Split Heaven and Earth are tied on this list. Ground Splitter Rabbit is a really solid Resonator card for the same reason that we had Thunder and Thunder Wolf on the same card in number 5. Split Heaven and Earth define the format. Basically, you're dealing damage to both you and your opponent based on the number of magic stones that are special magic stones that you have, which is really good if you are, running basic stones and you're not running special magic stones. This is a good way of closing out games. However, if you are wanting some board presence with Ground Splitter Rabbit, this is a really good way of doing that as well. It seems like there is some sort of potential for there to be a burn deck that plays 8 of these, although I would probably not advise you to do that. Next up, we have a combination of cards because these things don't function without the other, in my opinion. So we have both Atomic Bahamut and Atomic Turbulence. And the reason I have to put these together is because this combination of cards specifically just catapults Violet to one of the best decks in the format. So if you're playing either blue Violet or just regular, aggressive combo Violet, Atomic Bahamut and Atomic Turbulence are part and parcel together. Atomic Bahamut, you can reduce the cost of the card by removing atoms in your graveyard, and the effect to essentially blank the board, burn it for 4,000, and just swing in for game as a result of that is so powerful. It needs a little bit of protection. So that's where Atomic Turbulence comes in handy. It sets up your graveyard. You can discard up to 3 atoms and get a variety of effects, one of which being a Silence, which is in red for some particular reason. We have Law of Silence in red. So think of Silmeria from last video, but in red. And it just sets up the Bahamut play. And usually there's not much your opponent can do in response to something like that. So these 2 cards in themselves are a win condition, and they can just end any game if you're playing as Violet. Of course, in New Frontiers, we did see these cards sort of branch out a little bit and go into other decks like Asmodeus Atoms, which was a really interesting deck that we saw at the GP in Minnesota this past year. But these cards, I can't put them on the list unless they are together, so that's why they are both at the number 3 spot. Next up, we have cards that give your stuff swiftness, such as Claw of the Dragonoid and Sprinting Flame Horse. So Claw of the Dragonoid is specifically for your J-Ruler. It is 1 cost. It gives your J-Ruler swiftness and precision. Draw a card, shuffle it back into the deck to use sometime later on. However, if you want to have more utility in the stuff that you give swiftness to, Sprinting Flame Horse is the way to go. Of course, we got a new card in Dual Cluster that may or may not replace Sprinting Flame Horse. It's kind of hard to define if that's going to happen or not, but this basically targets a J Resonator you control. Gives it a little bit of additional attack and defense, plus swiftness. So there's some utility in that, in the fact that 1 is an inheritance ability, which means it can't be cancelled, except by something like Lorite or Witch with a Pointy Hat, if you have the required seal. However, Claw of the Dragonoids is just really good for being able to be reused over and over and over again. So really, both of these cards do the same thing, but they have some different mechanics attached to them. And giving stuff swiftness is basically what makes red good as a color. If red is good, it is because it can get stuff swiftness or deal massive amounts of damage or just do things very, very quickly to sort of overwhelm your opponent. And no cards express this better than Burning Rapidash and Swarming Cthulhu. The reason Swarming Cthulhu is on this list in particular is essentially because it works so well with Carlina, and Carlina is banned in the Wanderer format as of before the making of this video and before the making of this list, but this card is still incredibly powerful. Alongside Burning Rabbit Dash, you're essentially creating tokens that have various effects. Burning Rabbit Dash, once those tokens die, they're 3/3s, but they will deal additional damage. You combine that with something like Welser to make double the tokens, so now you have 6 tokens that all deal 300 each. You pair that with Shrine of the Dragonoids, suddenly all these tokens are dealing 500 or even 700 depending on what you're doing. All of these cards are doing some really interesting things alongside token generator decks like Belial. So these cards in particular are just some of the best tokens ever created in the game. And so for that reason, they are currently our #1 pick for the top 20 fire cards in the Wanderer format. But what do you all think? I know the last chunk of this list, the top 5, there were a lot of ties, mostly because we had cards that did something similar but a little bit different as well. So let me know what you think down in the comment section down below. Would you have these cards in this order? Are there cards that I missed? Let me know down in the comment section. And until next time, guys, this has been Paul, signing off.